Hello, good evening and a very warm welcome to the Redbridge Landlord Forum. My name is Richard Blanco and I'm the chair of the forum, and I'm also one of the London representatives for the National Residential Landlords Association. It's great to have you here. Before I run through the agenda, I just want to run through a few introductory matters. First of all, to let you know that tonight's meeting is being recorded. Now that will be useful, of course, for you if you want to view the webinar afterwards. So we will be emailing a link to the recording and also a feedback form to everybody. So if you want to listen to stuff again, then it will be available there for you. I am aware we're in the middle of Ramadan, so I do hope that you will be able to stay with us until the end, which will be up until about 8:30. But of course, if you're not, then please do catch up with any bits that you miss on the recording. Now, you will be able to ask questions and they will go through to our mediator, who will be looking through all of the questions that you ask, and we'll then be putting forward some of those questions to our presenters as we go through the meeting. So I'm just going to share the agenda with you now so that you can see that. Just bring that up there and bear with me. Right. We're starting off shortly with a licensing and enforcement update from Ed Chaplin, Cheryl Hart and Pule Chizokwa. We'll then move on to looking at permitted development rights, and we've got Ewan Coke from Planning and Building Control. We will also be looking at possession proceedings and be getting an update from Karen Shaw, who's Head of Housing Needs. We've got a slot this time as well on managing maintenance and repairs effectively, and I'll be doing that as an interview with Jamie Fraser, who's an experienced landlord and campaigner. We'll be doing the launch of Redbridge Green Homes Grants with Ed Chaplin, Misha Kular and Soren Nellegard. And then we'll be finishing off with a final presentation from me, which is entitled After COVID, What Next for London Landlords? So that's what we've got for you this evening. I hope you find the meeting interesting, useful and enjoyable. I'm going to move straight on now then, and I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go. To Pule Chizokwa, and she'll be joined by Cheryl Hart and Ed Chaplin, who are going to give us a licensing and enforcement update. So over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Misha for putting on obviously what everybody will see is a very busy and hopefully very entertaining and informative programme for this evening. It's a very busy schedule, and Richard, I'll be quite happy for you to pull any of us up anyway through the proceedings to tell us to keep to time, because we haven't timed necessarily our presentations, and it's a very short space of time to get so much in. So we want to get through the whole agenda. We want everybody to share what we all have to say. Okay, so my role with you tonight is I'm going to introduce, I don't know why I get a particular slide in my own name, but I'm going to introduce myself. That's me, Interim Head of Consumer Protection Licensing. I'm overall, I suppose, responsible for the property licensing scheme in the borough that we have in the borough. You'll be aware there are three types of property licensing. There is the selective for the single occupancy households. There are additional HMOs, for want of a better word, small HMOs, housing multiple occupation, and then the larger HMOs. The whole purpose of the licensing programme, the licensing scheme, is to improve the quality of the residential offer in the borough. It comes as no surprise to anybody that probably the largest part of the residential sector in the borough is owner-occupied. Next in line is the private rented sector. It's a huge contributor to what we regard obviously as an essential part of life in our borough and providing homes for our residents. Followed on by the social landlord sector, the council themselves, obviously. We have a small stock, one of the smallest stocks in London boroughs, and then of course the other social landlords. So it's a huge job. The reason for the licensing scheme is simply that we want to work with landlords, improve the standards of the accommodation, and therefore improve the quality of life for our residents. That's what it's all about. And unfortunately, it's a licensing scheme. It carries a fee, and like most things in our British society, not many of us have need for police, but they're there and we all pay for them through our taxes. So licensing scheme is very similar. Unfortunately, there are the bad landlords out there. There are the unlicensed landlords out there who provide bad quality housing. And unfortunately, the good guys, and Richard and co, and most of you that are here tonight, I'm sure, unfortunately, we have to fund a service, an enforcement service that also deals with the bad guys. Thankfully, there aren't so many of those around now, but there are some, and we'll hear a little bit about it in this presentation. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over now to Pule. She's going to give you a little bit of an insight into how and what we do in relation to our enforcement activities and dealing perhaps with some of the bad landlords I've just mentioned.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Hello, my name is Pule Chisokwa and I'm a Senior Housing Enforcement Officer. So to begin with, I'm just going to go through the different work streams that we have within the housing enforcement team. So to begin with, we have the reactive team who deal with complaints from tenants regarding substandard accommodation. So the reactive team provides a quick response to complaints, and where the hazards are deemed to be category 1 hazards, we'll make sure that the landlords, the agents, carry out the relevant remedial action. And where that doesn't happen, then we will issue the relevant notice depending on the situation. So whether that's a prohibition order, an improvement notice, etc., depending on the situation. The other teams that we have is the proactive team who do investigations into unlicensed properties. So we'll give the landlord or the agent the opportunity to license the property, and where the property remains unlicensed, we'll take out the relevant enforcement action, whether it's a financial penalty notice or a prosecution. And we'll also take action where there's like breach of HMO management regulations. The third work stream that we have is the compliance team, and the compliance team inspect properties where a license application has been made to ensure that the property meets the minimum standards and that it's safe for all the occupants. So we inspect all HMOs and we inspect 10% of the selected properties. So this next graph shows the enforcement visits that the enforcement team has done from January 2020 to the 31st of March 2021. So as we can see, in February, where we peaked, we were on like 375 visits that month. And then that steadily declined down to April, May. And again, that was due to COVID and the national lockdown that we had. Over the summer, the visits started to pick up again and then declining again in November, December, January, again, due to the lockdown that we've had. So the COVID-19 pandemic has had a big impact on our enforcement activities, and largely it's been, as you can see, there's been a huge reduction in the actual physical inspections that we've done. However, as a service, we have adapted quite well and kind of prioritised the important work streams. So enforcement action was limited to urgent cases, so urgent cases with category 1 hazards, to ensure that we could get those remedied as quickly as possible and make sure that residents are living in safe conditions. The proactive team prioritised high-level complaints, especially with those where there were ASB issues, and there was an increase in ASB complaints issues, and I guess that's understandable given that, you know, you had a lot more people at home with the lockdown and everything, so that continued. We also progressed existing formal cases, many of which are time limited, so we had to make sure we got the paperwork in there to ensure that we could still progress with those formal cases and go to tribunal. So from March to June 2020, we had several officers who were redeployed to the council's wellbeing team, which was to assist with the council's COVID-19 efforts. From April to June 2020, the remaining officers undertook the HMO wellbeing project, which was just to make sure that those who were living in HMOs continued to be safe, and we provided advice regarding how they could be better protected during the COVID-19 pandemic. From August 2020 through to February 2021, we prioritised the HMO compliance inspections, and that was to reduce the backlog so that the licenses could be issued, and so that was a priority. So as of, well, from March 2021, we're now back to our full enforcement activities as the government restrictions are being eased. So this next slide here is just a breakdown of all the enforcement action that we've taken since January 2021. So we've got a list of all the notice types that we have served. I won't go through every single one of the notices because I'm mindful of time, but I'll just point out a few of the notices. For example, during this period, we served 121 final notices for the financial penalties, and we served 12 improvement notices, 9 prohibition orders, and also we attended 6 first-tier tribunal hearings. Those were done remotely, and we've got 7 active prosecutions, but many of those, the hearings have actually been deferred. So I think as a service, we've had to implement new ways of working due to the COVID-19 restrictions. So we undertook a lot more desktop investigations and exercises. So the preliminary investigations were being done via desktop. We've had an increased use of sort of pictorial and video evidence. So where we've got tenants complaining, you know, about disrepair, we will ask them to send us through some evidence that will help us assess, do an initial assessment as to the disrepair. And similarly, where works have been done, where landlords and agents have had works done, we'll ask for pictures. So at least that kind of moves the cases along, and certificates, etc. We've made sure our officers have adequate PPE where they have had to go and do inspections. That's not only to protect ourselves, but also to protect the tenants. So, and also we've carried out a risk analysis to make sure, you know, does this inspection have to be made, and also just make sure the relevant measures are in place, even just as simple as asking, you know, if the tenants are showing any symptoms of COVID-19 and if they are rearranging that inspection until the relevant time. So we've adopted in the smart agile working, so, you know, the use of technology, working from home, attending remote hearings and trials. So that's, you know, we've adapted quite well to that. So now in terms of the present and the future, since March, we're back to our full enforcement activities as the restrictions are being eased. And so, yeah, we anticipate a lot more enforcement activities as we go back to normal, you know, back to the levels of back to the pre-COVID levels, and we'll continue to provide a good service to the residents and support to the landlords in Redbridge. Thank you.
Hi, moving over to me, that's Cheryl. Just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see this. Let's get the right one. Okay, my name's Cheryl Hart. I'm the Property Licensing Processing Manager. We've had a busy old year with COVID, and you can see by this graph, the first graph, it's showing the amount of licenses we've completed since January 2020. When the first lockdown happened in March, April, we did give the landlords a 3-month payment holiday. So people who weren't able to pay at the time, we gave them a 3-month holiday break for payments. So a lot of licenses slowed down on the completions in this period. But as you can see, we've picked up through the year, and then beginning of this year, January, February, March, we've been going a bit more digital, and we've got a robot now in place that helps us process the licenses much quicker. So you can see how we've really improved. And the good news is we've got rid of our backlog now of selective licenses, which was hampering us a little bit to progress. So the good news is most selective licenses will be turned around within sort of 2 to 3 months from now on, which is good news for us and for the landlords. So this just gives you an idea of where we're at and how many selective licenses. So in March this year, we've issued nearly 2,000, so 1,975 selective licenses and 45 mandatory HMOs. If I move on to the next slide, oops, let's get rid of that. So let me move on. Right, this is just showing you the licence income for the last 12 months. Again, because of our increase in the licence production and completions in the last quarter, you can see that our income has gone up substantially because people have been paying their balances. So it's still a steady stream of licences coming in, and we're on target to do what we were hoping to get done this year. So achievements during lockdown, as I've said, the backlog of selectives we've now issued 15,761 selectives completed. We've only got approximately 1,000 or so which have been started and in the process of just waiting for payments or the final things to be sorted out so we can issue the final licenses. We've only got 95 new applications when I looked yesterday that hadn't even been started, but they should be issued literally within the next couple of days. So there's now less than a 3-month turnaround, and as I said, we've gone more digital, which is something the council is very keen to do to enhance the service, make it quicker, and so that people aren't waiting for their licenses. And this has been really helpful, and it frees up the staff to deal with more complex inquiries and problems. And I think Ed wants to do the last slide, so I'll move on for that one, Ed. And I don't know if you want to come in there, Ed.
Many thanks, Cheryl, and to Pule for a quick skip through what we're doing. I'm not going to say a great deal on here because this has already been covered. This is just more or less a summary of what we've achieved. The key thing is one thing I picked up there, Cheryl, from Cheryl's presentation is for all of our landlords listening as well, that fees income, you'll be aware, of course, that your licenses are 5-year licenses. So that fees income, irrespective of when it comes to the council, it has to be spread over the 5-year period to cover the period of your licensing and obviously to maintain the services that we're going to be providing, both in enforcement and support for landlords throughout the period of their license. So that's a key thing. One of our priorities as well, which really didn't come out in the presentation, but is there. Members of the council are very concerned, about the quality of life and housing for our residents, including our tenants and owner occupiers, etc. But a key issue in relation to that is antisocial behaviour. There's been a crime commission survey, and many of you, if you're local residents, may have even submitted a return in relation to that. Now that identified what are key crimes in relation to Redbridge. I'm trying to remember them. One of them was burglary, but fourth on the list, violent crime was obviously one issue as well, because that's a key problem in the borough. Violent crime, I will say, the point was made today at a presentation. 15 years ago, there was 1 murder in the London Borough of Redbridge in the whole year. Already this year, I forget the number, but we're up to about 19 murders in Redbridge already in the year. So Redbridge has changed very, very significantly, and everything that's in Redbridge contributes to that. One of the things that's a priority for our members of the council is antisocial behaviour and problems with neighbours. And trust me, I see them all because I deal with the complaints process for Redbridge residents, dealing with members of parliament, dealing with the leader of the council and other key members, cabinet member. And antisocial behaviour, very often, very, very often from houses in multiple occupation is a key thing that we're having to deal with and resolve. So one of our priorities in the coming year will be working with landlords with houses of multiple occupation and trying to work with those tenants in those properties to make life a little less hazardous for their neighbours. So that's about it really. It's a quick summary of our licensing processes. Cheryl's team are doing really well, really efficient, and new systems invoked there, so we're less cost to the whole system, and our enforcement activity now getting back to an even keel post-COVID. But I would stress our enforcement priorities. We use the principle called the 4 E's. Those 4 E's are engage, educate, encourage, and then finally, if that doesn't work, then we go to enforcement. So if you're one of those landlords that wants to work with us, you will very rarely find yourselves anywhere near that 4th E, and that's our objective. If we get to that 4th E, I think we've all failed. So that's it, and hopefully that's helpful to all of you, and I'll hand you back to Richard now. Thank you, Richard.
Great, thank you very much, Ed, and thanks to Cheryl and Poulay. We have had some questions in the chat, and I think I understand colleagues have been answering questions directly, so I won't put any questions to you now. Also, we are running a little bit late, so we'll go straight on to our next item with Ewan Coke from Planning and Building Control on permitted development rights. Over to you, Ewan. And we're just waiting to go through to Ewan. I'm not sure if he's there at the moment. We seem to be having a little bit of a problem connecting to Ewan. I'm just waiting to see if we can get anywhere. No, it seems like he's not there. Maybe he's been disconnected.
It looks like he's disconnected currently, Richard. His system is showing on hold. So
okay, well, I think what we'll do then is we'll go on to our next slot, and we can always bring Ewan back in once we re-establish connection with him. So our next slot is with Karen Shaw, who's Head of Housing Needs, and Karen's going to talk about possession proceedings and give us an update. Sorry to suddenly spring that on you, Karen. I hope you're ready to go.
I'm coming as quickly as I can.
Thank you very much. And there've been lots of changes, of course, on evictions and the notice periods and whether enforcement action can be taken. So I believe you're going to give us a bit of a summary on some of that, Karen.
I am in very headline style, however. Just to introduce myself to you all, I'm Karen Shaw, and I'm the Head of Housing Needs at Redbridge. And what that means in terms of the things I'm responsible for is things like homelessness and providing accommodation, including temporary accommodation, but also often accommodation in the private rented sector to prevent homelessness. And I manage things like the housing register or waiting list, as you may know it, and our choice-based letting scheme. And I'm also responsible for things like rough sleeping and kind of housing policy and strategy. So that's me. As all of you all know, and I've heard colleagues talking about the position over the last year, which has been impacted by COVID. One of the things that's been happening over the last 12 months is that there's effectively been an evictions ban that's applied across different types of stock. It's applied equally to the council's housing stock as it has to you as private sector landlord, and that is currently extended until the 31st of May. And if you look on the gov.uk website, you'll see there all of the information on there, and there's some really useful information on there for you guys as landlords. It says we strongly advise landlords not to commence or continue possession proceedings during this time without good reason, and I've put a little quote in there. Some of the things they've done in order to protect people around the pandemic, most particularly, has been about a 6 months notice period for most types of eviction action. That's obviously been there, recognising that it creates a very difficult situation if we've got emerging homelessness during the pandemic. And just to give you a flavour of the position that the council's been in terms of its temporary accommodation, we've seen a really significant increase during the course of last year in terms of the amount of temporary accommodation that we've had to provide for those who are homeless over the period. Now, one of the things that has made that easier has been that the evictions ban has meant that we haven't seen homelessness arising from the private rented sector. But just thinking about those in different situations, my service has dealt with nearly 350 people who've been rough sleeping over that 12-month period, so really at the crisis end of the situation. But so there's been this 6 months notice period. And as a result of that, they've also given an extension in terms of the period that a notice is valid, recognising that there's delays in you being able to act on and enforce the notices that you have. And the restrictions apply not just to actions under Section 21, but also on those who are applying for possession under Section 8. But there are some exemptions where there are shorter periods around serious antisocial behaviour, things like serious arrears, issues around the right to rent. And so there are some there's some recognition in there that there are some circumstances which are more serious and therefore need to be pursued. There are still requirements on you as landlords to do your normal day job and what you would do around homelessness, rehousing, in terms of keeping the home in good repair and meeting your obligations as a landlord. And you'll have found, as we have as a housing landlord, that some of that's more complicated at the moment in terms of going in and dealing with things like disrepair and things like getting gas safety checks done, but with people being more reluctant to allow people into their homes. I really would urge you, there's some very good advice, and I can provide the links if anyone would like them, to the information on the gov.uk website, which helps and gives some guides around how to deal with that if you need it. I suppose from my perspective, and part of my self-interested reason for coming to see you here today, was that what I'd really like to prevent is us being in a situation where there's lots of you feeling, as a result of the situation that we're in, that there's lots of possession proceedings that you need to pursue, and that we've got homelessness arising as a result. I completely understand that there will be lots of customers, tenants of yours who may be developing arrears, given the mounting kind of economic pressures that people are experiencing. And I suppose part of the reason for me being here is to say that what we actually want to do is help and work with you if those things are arising, so that we can work with you and with your tenant to prevent you needing to bring the tenancy to an end, so that you can retain a tenant if that's possible, and we can make sure that there isn't a rising homelessness, which is not really very good for anyone. And that might be that we get involved in, I don't know, helping your tenant with a claim for a discretionary housing payment, or we work with the three of us together to help a repayment plan if you've got arrears issues, or that we get someone connected into our Work Redbridge service, which helps people into employment. There's a whole range of things we can leverage to help you, and we'd like to do that. And I've put some contact details on the presentation for my Housing Solutions Manager, Amma. And Amma can make sure that if we're dealing with your tenant and working with your tenant, that we can engage with you and try and problem solve and get to a better position. And if we don't know your tenant, that we can reach out and see if we can try and help and resolve things and make things better. And that's why I've put the contact details in there. The other thing I just wanted to flag very briefly is that if some of you have got accommodation that's available and it hasn't got tenants in it, your tenants have moved on, then we are still, as we always have been, interested in potentially working with you to rent your property. And one of the ways that we do that now is through a Pan-London company that we're involved in called Capital Letters. And the other way that we might do it is through our own acquisitions team. And I've put our contact details there so that we can talk to you about that if it's helpful. Something odd happened during that, Richard. Did you lose me?
No, you're still there. I think I'm not quite sure if we've got your presentation still.
Has it come back?
That's. Were you on your last slide there?
I was on my last slide anyway, so I won't.
Okay.
I won't worry about it, and it will be shared. I've not come to talk at you for very long. I just came along in response to that particular those particular concerns about the fact that obviously there are changes around the way you're getting possession, and wanting to kind of emphasise the messages about wanting to work with you around preventing homelessness. And if you've got property that's available and nobody in it, and you'd like us to look at it, for those that haven't come across capital letters, which you may well not have done, they're a company that was set up. They're a not-for-profit company that is basically an amalgamation of London boroughs who've got together to do procurement together, so that there's kind of one offer and one kind of set of approaches to dealing with things. And we are part of that company in Redbridge, along with about 15 or 16 other boroughs. So if you're interested in talking to them, I've put the contact details on my slideshow, and they'd be absolutely happy to hear from you, and Redbridge would be really happy to get the properties you might offer through that route. If you've got properties in other areas, they are interested in a whole range of different places and spaces. So that's you know, a definite option. Or you can do the normal thing and contact our acquisitions team, who would be glad to work with you. So that's all I need to say.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, Karen. We have got some questions going on in the background, but I think what I'm going to do is press on with our agenda, and we'll come on to some questions later on. So I'm going to move on to our next item, which is looking at managing repairs. So I've got some slides on this for us, so I'll just start showing this. I'm hoping you can see my presentation there, and I'd also like to welcome now Jamie Fraser, who is the landlord and campaigner. Good evening, Jamie.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, great to see you. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, I know you've got a portfolio of properties mostly in Hertfordshire. Is that right, Jamie?
Yep, that's correct. Yeah.
Yes, and also I tend to call you a campaigner because I know you've been quite involved in various campaigns around Section 24 and various other things, which we probably won't go into now into too much detail, but I know that you're very active in terms of policy matters and trying to improve the lot for the landlords of the UK.
Yes, we do our best.
Yes, fair summary. Well, you know, we wouldn't do too badly trying to help landlords with maintenance and repairs, because it's can be quite a thorny issue. Sometimes I'm a little bit wary of putting this onto a landlord forum, because people can think it's a bit tedious and overly day-to-day, but actually there's a lot to be discussed about it, and it affects a lot of us, and I think a lot of us struggle with it. So that's why I've added it to the agenda today. I wanted to start first of all asking you about dealing with tradespeople, Jamie. Now, I know you're quite a hands-on landlord yourself. You do quite a lot of refurbishment work yourself. But when you're dealing with tradespeople, how do you tend to source them? Where do you find them? This is a question I get asked so much by fellow landlords. You know, how can you get hold of a good plumber, a good decorator, etc.? How do you source yours?
Well, there's two ways, really. I suppose if I'm looking for somebody new, it would be word of mouth, or somebody that I have met through a circumstance. So, for example, yesterday I met some decorators who were working on a house next door to mine. So you just go around, introduce yourself, look at the work. If it looks good, take their business card, and then you can go back to them in future. But that's not really how I'm doing it myself at the moment, because I've been in the business a long time. I have a regular crew of people who know me very well, who I know very well, and I can just call them, and pretty much at a moment's notice they can be there. But
that's key, isn't it, actually, Jamie? Because I mean, I remember I got a frozen pipe, happened to be in my own flat, and of course, because I've got a really good relationship with a plumber, he did come out the same day. But if it was just some random plumber, you know, he might have come on the same day, but he would have charged me a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. So always good to build the personal relationships. That's one of the first things you should be looking to do, I think.
Okay, and I wanted to ask you, I put here tips on surveying, and what I mean by this is identifying what the problem is and who needs to resolve it. I always remember getting someone out to fit an oven and they said, oh, I can't fit that because the carcass needs changing and that needs a carpenter. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, if you're going to fit an oven, shouldn't you be able to do the electrical stuff and the carpenter stuff? So surveying a problem, deciding which tradesperson is required can be trickier than we sometimes realise, can't it?
Yeah, to the inexperienced as well. If you're just starting out in this, there's going to be some trial and error. You've got to learn what you think needs to be done, and then speak to the right people and give them as much information as possible so that they can guide you then on what they think should be done and who needs to be involved. So for me, these days, I think if it's, I just categorize it in my head sometimes, even without even seeing the problem. And then I just pump that out to whoever the most likely person on my team is to go and do it.
And I have a sort of I have a sort of triaging system with my tenants where I ask them to send me pictures of what the problem is so that I can work out whether it's something I can pop over and sort out, or exactly which tradesperson I need so that I don't send the wrong person. And it seems to me that's one of the brilliant things about smartphones and technology now, that most tradespeople will want pictures, most tenants can send you pictures, etc. That's actually made surveying quite a bit easier, hasn't it, Jamie?
Yes, it has actually, and with things like WhatsApp as well, able to show videos and share videos so easily, that's a godsend really, because people can send you stuff at any time. You can pass it straight on to the relevant people and they can deal with it. And very, very often I find tradesmen are quite happy to deal direct with the tenants anyway. So
yes, and my phone, probably like yours, is sadly full of pictures of toilets and doors, videos of doors that don't close properly.
Yes. Oh yes.
This stuff is so useful. Yes. The all-important pricing. How do you manage pricing? There's a whole issue whether you go for a fixed price or a day rate, I suppose, when you're doing bigger projects. But generally, one of the trickiest things with managing pricing is when the scope of the job perhaps isn't altogether clear at the beginning, and maybe you agree a price, but then the job becomes bigger and the tradesperson says they want more money because it's going to be bigger than they originally thought. How do you manage that situation?
It's a case really of just suck it and see each time, and try to use your experience and common sense. I mean, I pick some works based on price work. I pick some of it on day rate. I always make abundantly clear with people right from the start that if it is going to get any bigger, I need to know about it straight away. The one thing I'm willing to tolerate anything, and I'm willing to work with people in every fashion that's going to get the job done properly. But the one thing I don't tolerate is if somebody says as a quote, this is absolutely 100 quid, and then they do the old trick where they come back to you after they've finished it and then say, not during it, because that's a different thing, but if they come back after they finished it and say, oh well, now it's 150, that's the one time when I don't put up with it, because a quote in advance is legally binding. That is a quote. So if they're going to change that quote, they need to tell you on the way how that is changing. They can't leave it till the end.
Yes, that's very good advice, isn't it, Jamie? That any changes to pricing should be negotiated as you go along. I mean, when I've done larger refurbs that perhaps cost 30, 40, 50,000, sometimes I've used a change form, and that's a form where we formally agree that something has changed, or it's going to change in price, or the scope of the work's going to change, and me and my builder will sign it. So if you want to be a little bit more formal about it, that's one way to do it, isn't it? I put down the next bullet point, contracts and schedules of work. When you're doing a refurbishment, are there times when you become a bit more formal and do come up with the schedule of work and price each element and get your builder or tradesperson to sign a contract?
I think on this one, it's going to be a case of do as I say, not as I do, really, because what I would advise anybody partaking in the meeting, or what I would advise landlords generally, is that you should always get this contracted and schedule of works properly. Get everything laid out in advance so that everybody knows what they're doing. That is the right way to do it. However, I have to say that that's not what I would do in my own life. Because I know my team really well and they know my houses really well. They've worked for me, for some of them for 20 years. They know exactly what I want. I can actually say to them, we've got this house for refurbishment, just get on with it, because I know what it's going to cost. I know how long they're going to take over it. You know, I know how roughly how much their day rates will stack up. So unless there's some major issue that occurs during the build, we're pretty much good to go all the way through. But I appreciate that for newcomers or for people that are just getting into the game now, that's not the way to do it, because that's how costs do run away with you. So for the inexperienced landlord, I would say get the right people in and get everything quoted in advance in writing, and that way you know what to expect and where you're going. Don't do it the way I do it.
And it doesn't have to be, I mean, it could just be an email that says, I'm writing to confirm that we have agreed that you will carry out the following works, list the works. The fee that we have agreed is this, and you will begin on this date. We expect the work to take 3 weeks or whatever. Just has to be an email like that, or if you like, write it as a letter and get the person to sign at the bottom to say that they confirm and they agree, that sort of thing. I must admit, I mean, I have, like you, I have a team, but my builder can be quite forgetful, so I do quite often still write stuff down, so that when at the end he says, I didn't say I was going to do that, I can say, well, it's here on the letter that I wrote to you. So sometimes I do absolutely. Now, we all hear horror stories of failed relationships, don't we, Jamie? And one of my neighbours, actually, she went through 3 lots of builders. And of course, that's the worst case scenario, isn't it? Because any builder picking up a previous builder's job will go, oh dear, oh, he made a terrible mess, oh, I'm going to have to charge you a lot for this. Yeah. They're always going to really ramp their price up. So it's quite important to try and stay on good terms, isn't it? But things do go wrong. I mean, have you had disasters where you've fallen out with tradespeople in the past?
I don't think you could be in any kind of building business like this where that wasn't going to happen. And the thing is, it just goes with the territory. It may not be anything you have done. You might be perfectly reasonable. You might be the one that's sticking to the rules. You might be the one that's sticking to the agreements you've made. But sooner or later, they are going to fall out with you. I mean, I've had this thing, I don't understand it, but plumbers and plasterers tend to work for me for sort of 6 or 7 years, and then suddenly they're not available anymore. And you think, well, I don't know what I've done to upset them, because they've known me long enough, but they've just evolved. They've moved on to other things. So
yes, I think they're sort of trades that send you slightly doolally, aren't they? Plumbing and plastering. Yeah. There's only so long you can look at white walls or magnolia walls, or, you know, make walls as even as possible. So it does seem to be there are certain trades where you do get characters that. I don't know. I don't want to overgeneralize. I wanted to ask you about warning signs, because I think trust is really important, isn't it? You know, if somebody starts to not tell me the truth, that starts to make me think maybe this relationship is coming to an end. Are there any warning signs you would flag up, Jamie?
I think that is a good one, and I am experiencing that at the moment with a plumber, actually, where I know he's not telling me the truth about things. I know he's charging me for things he hasn't done, and therefore I have replaced him. I've now got a new plumber in, and the new guy is working out pretty well so far. But I know that give it another 6 or 7 years, and the new guy will probably be doing something like that. And I think familiarity can breed contempt sometimes. It's good to have a selection of people you can call on, because otherwise they can start to take you for granted, you know.
I have 2 painting teams, actually, and I'm afraid I do play them off one another a little bit. So, you know, I sometimes don't give work to one, I give it to the other team, and I just try and keep them hungry for work, really. And it sounds a bit ruthless, but I'm afraid, you know, the property world can be a bit ruthless. How do you deal with tradespeople where they just haven't done a good job, Jamie? I mean, do you just tell it to them straight? Are you quite direct with tradespeople?
Yeah, I think, well, my natural character has always been to try to avoid conflict and to work things out well. So I'm somebody who will always kind of soak up the grief and try to keep things on a smooth and even relationship, no matter how badly I've been treated. But there are occasions when things are so bad that you have to just say, look, come on, that's not right. That's not what I'm paying for. You know it's not right. You can see it. So can we put it right, please? And sometimes they might grumble a little bit and moan, but you've got to say this. There's no reason why you should be the one with the problem. If you've paid them to do it, they have to solve it for you.
Yeah, you've got to be prepared to challenge people about poor work, haven't you? I mean, this is why sometimes people use builders or project managers who will speak the language of tradespeople and won't be afraid to challenge them. I think there are cultural dimensions to this as well. I mean, I think I'm Spanish, in Mediterranean cultures, we tend to be more comfortable with conflict and just arguing with people. So, and I also work with, I've got a Greek builder and he's exactly the same. So we can have blazing rows with one another and that's fine. But so it can be sort of horses for courses a bit on that, can't it?
It can.
Yeah. So just on the repairs mindset, there is this thing where sometimes landlords seem to be quite penny pinching. I also see this sometimes with agents. They just send someone who kind of does a bit of a bodge job. There's no TLC. They're not thinking, let's spend proper money on it and do it properly so that it doesn't happen again. Do you see that, or not? Is my head stuff full of stereotypes?
No, I don't think your stuff full of stereotypes. I think landlords fall into two categories, really. I think there are those people, like in the way that I would place you and I, actually, where if something needs to be done, it needs to be done. And the way I regard the cost is that if that's what it costs, that's what it costs. You've got to spend, you've got to invest. You're in this game really to make good investments. So you pay the price. But then the other camp that I do come across very occasionally, not very often, is that landlords don't want to spend money because things are expensive. Relatively simple things going wrong are expensive because you're paying things like high labour rates, or you're paying VAT for the other person, or you're paying for materials which are getting more and more expensive by the day. So even a simple fix like, I don't know, swapping a door over internally, that can suddenly come into hundreds of pounds, and that wipes out many months worth of rent repairs.
Yes, I mean, I changed the door frame recently, and of course that means you have to cut out the timber. It then, you need wood filler. Then you've got to go and come back because it's got to have time to dry. Yeah. Then you've got to prime it, undercoat it, top coat it. And these things can all add up to quite a lot, can't they?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I'm a great believer in budgeting for repairs. So I do set aside a certain amount of money every month. So I've got a pot of money for repairs. So I'm kind of ready to pay for repairs and expect them. I do sometimes get a bit frustrated with tenants who there seems to be a little bit of a tendency to have a kind of Airbnb mentality where tenants just expect, the slightest of things to be corrected by landlords. I don't know if that's just certain parts of London or certain sort of markets, but sometimes I feel like tenants think, the only control I have over my landlord is to make him or her do a repair, and I can get frustrated sometimes by some of the requests that I get for repairs. Do I just need to open my heart to requests from tenants, or do you think tenants can sometimes be a bit trying?
Yes, I think tenants are human beings. And as we know about human beings, there's every conceivable different sort of them. And therefore, some will be extremely compliant and helpful and you'll never hear from them. Others will be perfectly reasonable and report things as and when they come up, which is ideally what you want, the middle ground. And then others will literally be getting in touch with you to say, can you come and change a light bulb? I mean, I had one who said to me just the other day that let me see if I can describe this. The outside plastic flap from a vent which led out through the wall, just the little flap that kind of hangs there on the vent, had fallen off, and could I come round and put it back? And I was like, well, actually, you could just clip it back into place yourself. It's on two lugs either side, And they were like, no, you've got to come and do it, And it
yes, I mean, I had a tenant say there was an error code on the dishwasher. So I said, well, have you looked in the manual? Have you thought about Googling the error code? And those sorts of things. I think it's important that we remind tenants that they're only really meant to call the landlord if they owned the property, they would call a tradesperson in.
Yes.
So, we would expect them to try and solve problems and unblock things, etc. And, only call us when they're absolutely stuck. I've put here just this bullet point on low maintenance refurbishment solutions, and I just mentioned that there because I think certainly when I fit things like showers, I try to make sure that there's a space under the shower tray so that if it leaks you can get access to it, and just trying to build in low maintenance options when you are refurbishing. And just finally to ask you, Jamie, about bringing in a builder or a project manager. Obviously it can be cheaper if you, or theoretically cheaper if you just manage trades when you're doing a refurb. Do you think it's better to bring in a project manager or even an architect to manage the tradespeople, or would you do it yourself?
No, I always do it myself, but that's because I have the confidence and the knowledge to do that. That wouldn't suit everybody. I think I would bring in a builder or project manager or an architect if I was doing some sort of extension like a developer. But if I'm doing any kind of refurbishment work, then no, I'm doing it all myself because it's really only handling a few phone calls.
Right, yes, yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I've just done a big refurb, and sometimes I wonder if I should have got an architect in, and I'll never know, you know, what difference that would have made. But I think I'm happy with the finished product now, and I've probably done better than I think I have. You know, we always have self-doubt, don't we? Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Jamie, for this chat. And
no problem.
I'm sure we could chat for another half an hour because there's so much on the topic. I hope our audience have found it interesting and useful. I'm going to just go back into the system and stop sharing my screen now. I'm not sure whether Ewan is back with us, and I'm just having a very quick look to see.
Yes, I am.
Sorry?
Can you hear me? I am back.
Oh, you are back, great.
I don't know what went wrong.
In that, welcome back. I hope you were okay wherever you ended up. Just said on hold on our system. So Ewan, you're going to talk to us about permitted development rights. Ewan's from Planning and Building Controls. So over to Ewan now, Ewan Coe.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, my name's Ewan. I'm from Planning and Building Control. I'm from the planning policy team at Redbridge. And I'm just going to do a very quick presentation on permitted development rights for office to residential development, also known as prior approval. So let's talk about how they began, where they started. Office to residential development is a form of permitted development rights, but it requires prior approval from the council. We all know what permitted development rights are, but for those of you that don't, it's basically a form of development that the applicant can do without planning permission. Prior approval means that even though it's a permitted development right, you have to still seek approval or prior approval from the council before you start your work. It came into force in 2013 under government legislation. It came in temporarily, and then in 2015 it was made permanent. However, the government are proposing now to replace it with a new form of permitted development rights in July 2020. But I'll talk about permitted development rights first, and then we'll come back to that towards the end of my slideshow. So how do you apply for office to residential development under permitted development rights or prior approval? Well, you don't need full planning permission. That's not required, but you must fill in an application form, and there's a picture of our application form there. You can download that from the planning portal, or you can download it from our website as well, actually. You must submit a full set of drawings and floor plans with your application form, and you have to submit some supporting documentation which relate to those issues listed there: transport and highways impacts, contamination risks, flood risks and noise, internal space and natural light. You can use that link there, redbridge.gov.uk planning and building, to get to the page to get one of these application forms. Just from that link, just navigate your way to our page on making a planning application. It's really easy to get there, and just follow the instructions, and you know, you should be able to access a form. I think you can either fill it in online, or you can download it if you want to fill it in, if you want to print it off and fill it in. So how does the council decide prior approval applications for office to residential development? Well, it's basically going back to the previous slide with the documentation that you submit. We decide it, and we can only decide it, on issues related to flood risk, noise, contamination, highways, internal space and natural light. We can't decide prior approvals for office to residential on issues like design, for instance. We can only decide it on those issues. And when I say decide it, it's basically deciding whether or not you need prior approval. If your application, the documents that you submit with your application covers those issues adequately, you will not need prior approval, and we will write to you and tell you so. If one of those issues are not covered adequately, you will need prior approval, and we will write and tell you so. But we'll work with you to get your application right. Buildings that you're looking to convert need to have been an office before or on the 29th of March 2013. Any sort of buildings that were not offices before then, or any buildings since then, don't apply. Applications have to adhere to minimum internal space standards, and those are national minimum internal space standards. Those are set out in our local plan. All habitable rooms that you create when you make your conversion from office to residential must provide adequate natural light. And any external changes that you want to make, you need to apply for after you've received prior approval from the council. So prior approval or office to resi permitted development rights generally apply to internal works. So if you want to do anything externally, you have to get your prior approval first and then apply for external works. All applications are community infrastructure levy liable. So think of it as a taxation on development, and it's related to floor space that's created, I believe. And the council have 56 days to decide. We always decide in 56 days. We will get back to you and tell you whether or not you do need prior approval. If we don't get back to you, I believe you can just get on with the prior approval conversion that you've applied for. But we always get back to you within 56 days. So going back to the proposed changes that the government want to make in July this year, if we just look back to September 2020, the government introduced a new permitted development, a new use class E. That use class covers commercial, business and service use classes. They did it basically to make high streets more adaptable to change. Obviously, spending habits, consumer spending habits have changed over the years. More people are buying things online. That's affected high streets, and obviously COVID has affected high streets massively. Less people have been using the high street, obviously, for obvious reasons. And the government brought in this new use class in order to make changes of use on the high street a lot more flexible. So, for instance, shops, if you can see on the image there, they used to be in use class A1, now they're in use class E. They can change without permitted development. They can change without planning permission to gymnasiums down there in the bottom right, D2 to E, because they're both in use class E now since the 1st September 2020. Everything in use class E, whether it's a cafe or an office or a creche, they can all change without planning permission now on the high street. And the government did it to make the high street more adaptable to change and make changes of use much more flexible. But not to outdo themselves, the government wanted to extend that use class, having created it back in September 1st, 2020. They wanted to extend that new use class E. They wanted to extend it to include residential or housing use to support housing delivery. So they consulted on a new national permitted development right. for change of use from commercial, business and service use classes, all in Class E, as we just discussed. They consulted on that being extended to residential as well between December 2020 and January this year. So the new use class that they've already created will now mean that all of those changes, all of those use classes that we've just talked about in Class E, will also be able to change to residential use without planning permission. And they propose to replace the existing permitted development rights for office to residential prior approval. They propose to get rid of those in July, end of July this year, and replace it with this new use Class E. So once they've replaced it, there'll be a much more scope for developers and landlords to take advantage of conversions, not just from offices to residential, but say from a cafe to residential, or from a creche to residential, or from a shop to residential, all in use Class E, gymnasium to residential, all in use Class E. And you'll be able to do it without planning permission. You'll be doing it under permitted development rights. So that's the government's new proposal. If you're looking to make an application for prior approval, office to resi, you can still do that up until the end of July this year, or you can wait and see what the outcome of the government's consultation is. The government still haven't decided exactly what they want to do. These are all just proposals. But you can wait until after July, after which time, as I've said, developers and landlords will have much more scope to convert from high street uses to residential. I hope it's not too complicated for you. That's the end of my quick presentation. If you've got any questions, I'll try and answer all your questions. If you've got any development management type questions, I may have to get back to you.
Thank you, Ewan. That was really useful and very interesting to hear about this new use Class E, which I wasn't aware of those changes, so it's great to be informed about that. We're getting quite a few questions in the chat, and what we've been doing is the relevant person's been answering them in the chat. So we're going to stick to that for now because I'm conscious of time. We're running a little late. So we're going to move on straight away to our next speakers, and that's Ed, Misha and Soren, who are going to talk to us about the launch of the Redbridge Green Homes grants. So over to Ed, Misha and Soren. We seem to have some sort of delay. Oh, here we go. No, the transition is happening before our very eyes. There we go. And it's Ed, I think, who's going to start us off. Ed Chaplin, who's Interim Head of Consumer Protection and Licensing.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Second slot tonight. This is a bit of a double act between myself and Misha. I'm not going to claim any credit for any of the work that's gone into Redbridge Go Green grants. Misha is the absolute champion in relation to this, and what Misha has managed to do for the landlords and residents of Redbridge, she has managed to secure £1.7 million worth of government grant to enable us within the borough to retrofit some of our properties and to improve their performance certificate ratings. So we've adopted that logo. I hope you will get used to it and see it all over the borough's publicity materials, in local newspapers, bus stops, wherever it happens to be. We're using that logo to really promote this particular initiative and looking to get our retrofit works done through our properties. We've got a very short time frame to use that £1.7 million worth of funding, which you can see as a headline there. We've got to get it done by September this year. Now, we'll probably be able to extend that a bit, but what we're doing is we're going to be working hard to identify landlords, identify households, identify those that qualify. There is a qualification, an income qualification in order to qualify for it, and it's a very short programme. I'm going to ask Misha to step in, and Misha, you'd like to introduce our delivery partner who we've recently engaged to help us to work with this very tight schedule.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly, before I do that, I'll just quickly run through the eligibility of the scheme. So if you're a homeowner or landlord, you're eligible to apply for it. You need to have a household income of £30,000 or less, and your property should have a current EPC rating of D, E, F or G. So the household income relates to the tenants in the property if it's rented, and not the landlord's income. So many of you in your rented properties will have an EPC certificate already. If you don't know whether you do, you can check that on the EPC register website, and don't worry too much if you haven't got one, because as part of the application process, if you're eligible, it will go forward to survey and that will be checked. So in terms of costs and funding, if you're an owner-occupier, you can receive up to 100% funding, up to a maximum of £10,000. And if you're a landlord, you'll need to contribute 1/3 of the costs, and the grant funding is limited to £5,000. So the table below, you can see the breakdown there. So the total cost of measures for 5,000, you'd get 3,333 from the grant funding, and you would need to pay the contribution there of 1,667. And then again, the top end there, if the value of the works comes out at 10,000, you'd get the £5,000 from the grant, and then you would need to contribute 5,000 as obviously you've gone over the threshold there, but you can see how that is split out. So what happens when you're eligible? We refer you to our delivery partner, Retrofit Works, and they will carry out a survey and give you a whole house plan. And that will be discussed and agreed with you about the measures that you want to happen. But currently we're offering solar panels, loft insulation, solid wall, floor or cavity wall insulation. We can't do any kind of fossil fuel heating systems like gas boilers, whether it's new installations or as repairs, because they basically don't fit under the criteria for reducing carbon emissions. So in order to apply, it's a pretty straightforward process. If you go onto our website and type in Go Green, you'll find out more about the scheme, and there's an online application form. So for rented properties, both the landlord and the tenant will need to complete the application for assessment, and we can't process the applications until we've received the information from both parties. So once your survey and everything's done and you're happy to commence, it's at that stage before the work commences that the landlord needs to pay the 1/3 contribution. So we've got a couple of officers working in the grants team for the Go Green grants. That's Sean and Daisy, so that they handle all of the applications as they come in. But if you've got any queries aside from what's on the website or the application, then just drop us a line at Housing Standards and we'll get back to you. So as I mentioned, once you've passed the eligibility criteria, we'll contact you, and then we will refer you to our partners, Retrofit Works. And Kath, the scheme manager, is here tonight, and she's just going to run through with you what their part of the process is. So over to you, Kath. Kath, I don't think we can hear you, so I'm going to mute mine and see.
Sorry, I think I must have pressed my mute button. You can hear me now, I hope.
Yes, we can.
Yes, all fine. All
okay,
fine.
I'll charge forward. Sorry about that. So, yeah, as Misha said, my name's Kath Gagan. I'm a scheme manager at Retrofit Works, and as Misha mentioned, we're helping Redbridge to deliver their grant scheme to the homeowners and landlords across the borough. So I'm just going to give you a bit of info about who we are, what we do, and how the process is going to work, just at a very high level. So Retrofit Works, we're a not-for-private profit cooperative. We've been around since 2013, delivering schemes across London and the UK. As a cooperative, we're owned by our members, who are the local businesses, professionals and trades that help us deliver our energy efficiency retrofits. So this includes the surveyors, the energy assessors, retrofit coordinators, builders, the measures installers, amongst others. All of our members are pre-vetted before joining, and we oversee the work done to ensure quality standards are being met on each install that they work on. The terms of this government grant require all the tradespeople to have appropriate accreditations with Trustmark or MCS, so that they've got that second level of accreditation as well. If you can remember, I mean, thinking back to the conversation earlier about how do you find a good tradesperson, recommendations is important. If you know anybody who you think is high quality and would be interested in joining our cooperative and working on this scheme in the area, we're always ready and willing to welcome new members on board. We're running similar schemes with the boroughs of Richmond and Wandsworth as well. So we've got an established process and work available. So I'll now give you a quick walk through the process. Okay, so as Misha described, first step is to register your details on the council website. Your details will then be passed to us once they've checked your eligibility details. The next step is a telephone interview. So simply we'll first of all email you just to confirm we've got your details, and then we'll give you a call just to understand a bit more about your property, explain in more detail how the process works, and schedule the survey in your property. We'll also need to complete a risk assessment from a COVID-19 perspective. So we want to make sure that whoever's in the property understands how we'll safely conduct the survey of the property, and also what they need to do if they have any symptoms on the day of the survey and things like that. The energy assessor will do the technical survey, so they'll be taking measurements and taking photos, which we pass to the retrofit coordinator, who's the expert that will recommend the most appropriate improvements for your home that are within the scope of the grant. That retrofit coordinator will put those improvements together in a package. This is a whole house plan, and it will have the likely costs of those measures balanced against the grants that are available, and also the contribution that you will need to make. It will also show details of further improvements that you could make that may be outside of the scope of the grant, that would also increase the EPC rating, that you could decide that you want to do at a later date at your own cost, but that will be broken down in that initial package. So once we've agreed the work that you want to do, we'll get one of our contractors to quote for the work. They may need to visit the property, but we always try to aim for that to be done remotely. We'll send you those quotes in a proposal, and once you're happy with that, and we have an agreement in place, we arrange for the contractor to visit at home and to install the work. So as Misha said, we've got till end of September to help. It's around 250 homes across Redbridge, so we're very keen to get as many people started. So please do register your details, and hopefully we'll be making our first phone calls, if not tomorrow, very early next week. Thanks, Misha.
Okay, thank you very much, Kath, and I think that completes Misha and Kath's presentation on the launch of the Redbridge Green Homes grants. Of course, the voucher scheme is not open anymore, so the only Green Home grants you can get are via local authorities, and there are a few schemes operating in London. We've had a question about does the NRLA have a list of local authorities that are operating schemes? Unfortunately, we don't. The scheme was run by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, so I presume they will have a list of local authorities whose bids were successful and contact people for the scheme. So I think that they would be the best port of call if you wanted to know what all of the schemes were nationally. Okay, I'm going to move on now, and in fact it's over to me now because I'm going to do my presentation on which is called After COVID, What Next for London Landlords, and this is just a little bit of crystal ball gazing as to what might happen over the next few months, and also a bit of reflection, a few observations of what's going on at the moment. Now, Karen has covered most of this, still living with COVID evictions, because of course, as you know, we still have a six-month notice period for Section 8 and Section 21 proceedings. Now, that's in place until 31st of May, as Karen has said. We have been assured by government at the NRLA that this 6-month notice period will taper away after that period. We were concerned that it would stay in place until the abolition of Section 21, which is on the cards. I'll tell you a bit more about that. But it's a question of watch this space. We don't know what the government's going to do. Also, that limits on enforcements will be lifted, the government has told us, but again, you know, the limits on enforcement have been extended many times. That we hope that the government will stay true to their word and not extend those limits to enforcement again. Coming next, the Renters Reform Bill. So this is the most important piece of legislation on the cards, really, for the private rented sector. What we know is that the government is committed to abolishing no-fault eviction. So that Section 21 will be abolished in future. We're only going to be able to evict tenants through Section 8 proceedings, and the government's discussed changes to Section 8 grounds. There is a consultation paper that they issued on that, so have a look through that if you want some insight into their thinking. I've just listed a few examples here. What they suggested was that it should be relatively easy for landlords to get possession of their property if they wanted to sell or refurbish or move members of their family into the property. That issues like antisocial behaviour or domestic abuse could enable, if those issues occurred, then landlords would have easier access to gaining possession. At the moment, there's a ground under Section 8 where education institutions can gain possession of properties, but that doesn't extend to landlords letting to students. So, you know, that's one of the issues that certainly we'd be looking at if the government, you know, when the government does bring this legislation forward. And another issue was whether there should be an accelerated procedure where the tenant is in arrears, perhaps for 2 months or more, as we have with Section 21 at the moment. There's the accelerated procedure there. This was mentioned in the government's consultation paper, but we don't know if it's something that they would go forward with. Now, what we also know is that this won't be retrospective, so any assured short-hold tenancies that are in place up until when the new legislation comes in will still be effective. The government's also suggested that it wants lifetime deposits to come in. So this would be a deposit where the tenant pays a deposit, and rather than having that deposit paid back to them by the landlord and then paying the deposit again to a new landlord, that deposit will be transferred from one landlord to another. Now, there are some practical concerns there. So, for example, normally it takes the landlord up to 10 days to return a deposit because we need to assess whether any damage has been done to the property. But of course, the tenant often moves out of one property and into a new one on the same day. So that's a slight kind of practical issue that could be difficult to overcome. The NRLA has proposed mediation to try and avoid tenants and landlords having to go to court at all, and we await the government's response to that proposal. Now, what we don't know is when the bill will be introduced. We have no idea. The government has said that they're looking to introduce it as soon as possible, but clearly they're very preoccupied with COVID at the moment. And we don't know what will replace assured short-hold tenancies. Of course, in Scotland, they have the private residential tenancy, which was a new one that was brought in when they abolished no-fault eviction. We don't know what the new Section 8 grounds will be yet because the government hasn't come forward yet with concrete proposals. So what might the Renters Reform Bill mean for you? Well, do have a look at the NRLA proposals on the NRLA website and see what you think. See if you think that they will meet your needs. I think it's useful to review your use of Section 21 in the past, and I have done that myself. I've been a landlord for nearly 20 years now, and I've probably only ever used the Section 21 about twice. So it's, you know, not as terrible as I might initially think, that, you know, I'm not going to be able to use it in future. But, you know, I've had to think through what I might have done if Section 21 didn't exist. Now, how do you need to adapt your business going forward? Well, tenant selection is going to be absolutely key, and I've certainly made it a cornerstone of my business that I'm very rigorous now in my tenant selection. And make sure you do proper referencing. You can use NRLA tenant check, which just costs £24.50 per applicant if you want to do full employment, landlord and credit checks of tenants. Now, certain tenant groups could suffer, for example, tenants on benefits. It may be that landlords become more reluctant to take tenants on benefits because they're more likely to fall into arrears. There could be implications for the student sector because, you know, currently in a lot of UK towns and cities where there are universities, landlords issue 9-month contracts and expect the tenant to kind of move out at the end of the academic year. Well, that won't be possible when Section 21 is abolished unless there's a special kind of educational grounds put into Section 8. For some landlords, it will be the last straw, and it could mean a smaller private rented sector. Some landlords may just decide that they've had enough and they don't want to carry on. So, you know, it may mean, maybe beneficial, of course, to those of us who stay in because there may be less competition. Looking at regulation now, so around the regulatory corner, well, electrical safety is already here and here to stay. 5-year checks are compulsory for all tenancies and have been from the 1st of April 2021. They were compulsory for new tenancies from the 1st of July 2020. You have to give a copy to the tenants within 28 days and also to applicants before marketing. There's a penalty of £30,000. And many landlords are finding significant works are required. I've just had to change a consumer box in one of my flats that I'm just about to let. And in fact, I think that's the 3rd or 4th consumer box that I've had to change. And in fact, it's been quite interesting because I've realised that I often don't really look at consumer boxes and think, are they up to standard? I just kind of assume they are because the lights work. So it has certainly forced landlords to kind of review the electrical safety of the property, so it's probably no bad thing. I've also taken advantage of having an electrician in the premises and installed mains connected, radio interlinked, smoke alarms, even though they're not required for properties with related individuals. Who knows, the requirements may change in future, and of course if I then have unrelated people in the property and it becomes an HMO, then that they would be a requirement. And of course, the fire safety bill is coming up later this year, and it may be that carbon monoxide alarms could become compulsory as part of that, although there's no specific move to do that yet. Now on energy efficiency, well, there was a consultation which ended on 30th of December 2020 around the minimum EPC going forward. It proposed that there should be C for rented properties by April 2025 for new tenancies and April 2028 for existing tenancies. If the landlord had to spend more than £10,000 to bring their property up to an EPC of C, then they could be exempt. And the consultation suggested that they thought something like 10% of private rented sector properties would become exempt. Now, 67% of private rented sector properties are D or lower. And I think it's going to be a really tall order for us to get properties up to C, particularly if you have Victorian terraces. Most of my properties are Victorian terraces, and really the only way to get them up to C might be external cladding or internal wall insulation, or exterior wall insulation on the inside of the walls. And I'm very reluctant to do that. It's very disruptive and costly. And I'm not sure that, you know, people are going to want all of their Victorian houses to be clad with external cladding. So I can't see this really happening myself. But, you know, it's there in the consultation. The government's committed to improving the energy efficiency of housing stock, and this is what we're told is going to happen. Now, the Green Homes grants certainly followed through this kind of fabric first approach. They were withdrawn on the 31st of March. That's the voucher scheme. Of course, you can still get grants from Redbridge Council. It was quite a complex system. The emphasis was on insulation and low carbon heating, and we're very frustrated at the NRLA that government's withdrawn this. It's difficult for landlords to have confidence in the government around green homes grants after the Green Deal was withdrawn way back in 2014 or 2015, I think that was, and now this has been withdrawn. So a lot of us are very frustrated about the government's strategy on this. Quick look at what's happened in the budget and any fallout from that. Well, changes that do affect us. The stamp duty holiday up to 500,000 continues until the 30th of June. So there's no stamp duty to be paid on properties that purchased up to 500,000. You will still pay the 3% additional stamp duty if you already own a property in the UK or indeed anywhere in the world at the time you buy another property. That 0% threshold is lowering to 250,000 until the 30th of September, and then it's back to normal. Now, I think the Chancellor did that because quite a few people were struggling to get their conveyancing done by the 31st of March. It still does leave a kind of cliff edge, doesn't it? Because, you know, people are definitely going to try and buy now or try and sell now before those deadlines. Now, income tax thresholds have been increased slightly to 12,570 for the basic rate and 50,270 for the higher rate. They have been frozen though until 2026, so that's a bit of a kind of stealth tax increase, isn't it? Interestingly, corporation tax will remain at 19% for profits up to 50,000, but goes up to 25% for profits over 250,000. And you know, that's of interest to a lot of landlords because many are being encouraged to incorporate or to only buy properties through limited companies. This is one of the dangers, of course, of dancing around the taxman, because you can structure your business around cheaper tax rates only to find that the government then increases those tax rates. So that could become an issue for you. And certainly you need to think long and hard about whether to buy through a limited company. You may pay less tax, but you will pay a dividend tax to take money out of the limited company, even though corporation tax is lower than income tax. You will also pay higher mortgage rates of 3% or more, whereas you could pay as low as 1.5% if you're buying personally. So you do need to do a spreadsheet and work out which is best for you. Capital gains tax zero rate was frozen at 12,300, so you can make a capital gain of up to 12,300 without paying any tax. What didn't change is we did expect capital gains tax rates to go up to 40%, so we're all very relieved that that didn't happen. Of course, the Section 24 tax changes, which mean that we are taxed on our turnover and we can only reclaim on expenses, on finance expenses at 20% and not at 40%. That continues, and of course many of us believe that will stay for at least a generation. Looking at the roadmap out of COVID measures, well, we're about halfway through this, aren't we? It's been quite enjoyable sitting outside in cafes, at least sitting at a table and being able to read the paper and going to the barbers, etc. I'm sure lots of you will have been relieved, and going into shops. The next step is 17th of March, when most businesses will reopen and hospitality will open indoors too. And COVID regulations are due to end on the 21st of June. Let's hope that that does become a reality. The housing market and construction sectors have remained open, of course, for most of the COVID period. But of course, furlough schemes will end at the end of September 2021. They're continuing until then. Now, the Bank of England thinks that we'll have quite a quick bounce back from the lockdown slump. The economy slumped 4.2% in Q1 this year, and the Bank of England thinks that it will bounce back pretty rapidly. But remember, we have got these stamp duty and furlough, what I'd call cliff edges. So, you know, potentially we could see quite a lot of redundancies after September. We're likely to see fewer people buying and selling after September as well because of the stamp duty holidays ending. Lenders are quite optimistic. They've had very high volumes, and they've got some good mortgage rates at the moment. They must increase the capital that they hold for buy-to-let lending by 2023, so that we could see some shifts in the availability of buy-to-let loans by then, although I think a lot of them are working up to that deadline already. The big question is, when will the house price cycle end? Of course, this cycle began in 2008. It peaked around 2016, 2017. It's been fairly buoyant recently because of the stamp duty stimulus. But, you know, will it end after the stamp duty stimulus, and will prices take a bit of a dip? Will there be a global recession? Now, it's predicted that unemployment will get to around 7%. There is quite a lot of pent-up spending, and people have been saving because they've not been spending so much in lockdown, but there are also kind of hard-pressed families as well who are struggling to make ends meet. There are also Brexit factors like changes to migration, so we're seeing fewer migrants from the European Union now, and that could affect how many tenants want to rent in London. And also it's harder to do business with the EU now, so that could have an economic impact. Just finishing now with some housing market stats. So, I mean, look at how busy the housing market was in the autumn with stamp duty, the stamp duty holiday. There were over 100,000 transactions in October, which is the highest since 2016. Nearly 100,000 mortgages in October, which was the highest since 2007. House prices went up 6.9% in the 12 months to February, according to Nationwide. Capital Economics had predicted a 5% fall this year, but Rightmove is predicting a 4% increase, and I think that's what we're more likely to see this year now. The NRLA runs a survey of landlord optimism in their own letting business. It's pretty low at the moment at 35, although that's not the all-time low. It has been a bit lower than that. It was in the 50s and 60s in 2016, 2017. So, you know, we're still quite a lot more pessimistic than we used to be. Interestingly, only 20% of landlords are thinking of reducing their portfolio over the next 12 months, and 16% are thinking of expanding. Now, that gap of 4% is the lowest it's been for quite a while. These are the predictions. I've just borrowed this from Savills, and you'll see they're quite gloomy about this year. They're looking at minus 7.5% fall this year across all areas. But they do see things picking up next year, and they're particularly optimistic about the Northwest, the North and the Midlands. They think that London is going to remain pretty subdued over the next 5-year period. Just a quick look at London market trends. Well, COVID has obviously had the biggest impact on central London Zone 1. Activity and rents have been down by around 25% there. Short lets and international student sectors have been particularly badly affected. And there's been a lower demand from corporates and young professional sectors. So, you know, they might have filled that slack left by short lets and international students, but they haven't. Now, zones 2 to 4, those sort of fashionable neighbourhoods like Hackney, Ealing, Clapham, Hampstead, they stayed fairly perky. I let a flat a couple of weeks ago in Hackney. It had a garden, which was of course very important at the moment, and that I had 3 offers on the same day. It just was snapped up really quickly, whereas I'm hearing from other people in other parts of London they're really struggling. Now, in terms of tenant trends, yes, we are seeing families leave London, going to the suburbs and out into the country. Quite a lot of sharers are moving. Either they're sort of driving one another mad and so they need to split up, or people are splitting up from partners, or they're wanting to move in with new partners. We're seeing a lot of that. Outdoor space is at an absolute premium at the moment. People are desperate for it. And also we're seeing cheaper rents in outer London, as you know, people are sort of moving out from zones 1 and 2 looking for cheaper stuff, and that's tending to depress rents. In places like Tottenham, I just let a studio flat there at a lower rent than I had previously. Should you be buying, selling or holding? Well, reasons to buy if the market dips later this year, but you might want to try and get the timing right. And of course, that's always difficult. And there's the question over whether mortgage availability will stay as buoyant when and if people start being made redundant after furlough ends in September, October. Reasons to hold? Well, some people may be giving up on the private rental sector because they're frustrated with tax changes and increased regulation. So we may end up with a smaller, more professional community, and if you want to be part of that, then you know it's worth staying. We might see rising demand after COVID. Some people think there'll be a V-shaped recovery in London. People will be desperate to rent in Zone 1 again and to get back to the buzz of kind of central London. Reason to sell? Well, if you want to take advantage of the stamp duty holiday, you need to be quick. You may well be too late now because it's taking some boroughs a long time to get searches through, and conveyancing is going pretty slowly. We are seeing short-lived price rises, so you may want to take advantage of that now. And other reasons to sell, as I say, some people are getting frustrated with the prospect of Section 21 being abolished and new regulation and tax changes. Just a final mention of the podcast. So do listen to the NRLA podcast if you have time. It's called Listen Up Landlords, and you can just Google that or go to the NRLA website. We also have the NLA website. You can go to, if you Google the NLA podcast Apple, and listen to that there, or Google Inside Property for legacy editions of the NLA podcast. If you want to join the NRLA, we'd love to have you as a new member. Just Google join the NRLA, and that will normally cost you £75 per year by direct debit, or if you use my discount code R59, you can get a £10 discount. So do make a note of that, and it'd be great if you could join us. If you get lots of discounts on services, and you can use the advice line, of course. There's the number for the advice line, but you will need to be a member to use it. So that's my presentation, and that is the final presentation this evening. So I'm just going to, whoops, so I can find the correct screen, stop sharing my screen. And now I'm just having a quick look to see what's going on questions wise. It looks like most of our questions have been answered by individual speakers, and it's getting late. So I'm just checking to see if I've got any questions coming up from my colleagues. No, I haven't. So I think it's 8:38, and we overran slightly. I think I'll draw the meeting to a close unless there's any other points that Ed or Misha want to bring up before we finish. I'll just leave a quick gap for you to come in there if you'd like to.
Anything I'd say, Richard, thank you everybody for attending and hearing what we've had to say this evening. If anybody has any questions, it's easy to get in touch with us, London Borough of Redbridge, and you can come through to, I'm not sure what our I'm not prepared, I'm afraid, for this one, but I'm not prepared what our email address is. But if you...
I've got it here actually, Ed. So PRS licensing at redbridge.gov.uk. If people can contact us on that, can't they? And Amisha and colleagues will pick up the email.
We will. Thanks very much.
Right,
thanks, everyone.
Yes, and thank you to you, Misha, and colleagues for your fantastic efforts in organising this evening's event. And a huge thank you as well to all of our speakers. It's brilliant to have you with us, and I really appreciate your being so brief and articulate and getting your points across so succinctly. Now, do remember that tonight's event has been recorded, and you will get a link sent to you so that you can watch the recording. We'll also be sending a feedback form to you, so do let us know what you thought of the event. I'm not sure if we're going to be having another webinar or whether we'll be able to meet live face-to-face shock horror in the near future. Of course, if after the 21st of June all COVID regulations end, then who knows. I suspect it'll be a while though before everything gets back to normal, but we'll be in touch with you to let you know if we're going to be running another event. But all that remains for me to say is a huge thank you to everyone for joining us. Special thanks to those who stayed with us. If you're waiting to break the fast, it's Ramadan. Thanks for staying with us, or if you're watching us in the recording, thanks for coming back to us. All that remains for me to say is have a fantastic evening, everyone. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you, and good evening.
Thanks, Richard.